Hello, I'm recording a couple of videos about two books that I've written. The previous one was about a novel, but this one's about a collection of essays, which is very imaginatively entitled "Collected Essays." Um, I just wrote 8 essays. There's no theme. They're not linked. I just wrote 8 essays, and I just bungled them all together in a book. But they are academic essays, so they have sources. Yeah, they have sources, and they're academic essays. So all I'll do in this video is I'll go through each individual essay and explain what it's about. That's it. The first one examines the relationship between the film 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick and ideas of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. So what do I look at in the essay? I look at some these ancient theories and how they come through in the film. So that includes theory of forms, the theory of the cave, prenatal recollection, and a theme like transcendence, and that in some ways prefigures Christianity. So the theory of forms, I don't know what you know about Plato's theory of forms. Basically, Plato believed that underlying material reality were forms, and that each time you see a chair, it's an imperfect representation of an ideal universal. There's a universal such a thing as chairness, or there are underlying reality. There are universals which are truer than the real world, and they are conceptual. And what we see in the physical material world are imperfect manifestations of those universals. And every object we see is underpinned by those forms. So I look at some scenes in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I look at the scene with a monolith, and I say that this is a Platonic form for existence, and how the whole planet originated. I look at the bone in the film, and I look at how that's symbolic of of weapons and war. And later on, I look at the theory of the cave, which is, of course, the moment in which the primates are in the cave, and obviously the theory of the cave is that people are in a cave, and what they don't know anything. But once they discover Plato's theory of forms, they've seen the truth and they've gone out of the cave. So they're in ignorance, and that's what indeed happens in 2001: A Space Odyssey. The primates are inside the cave and they don't know anything until they see the monolith, and they begin to start a civilization. And prenatal recollection is a Plato believed. Of course, it seems odd now. It's an odd theory that we are born, and when we are a fetus, when we first come into being, we know everything. And when we come into being in the world, we start to recollect things that we knew before we were born, and they come to us. And the reason why I said that is because we have inherent reasoning capabilities. Our brains, our minds have. We are capable of learning language. We are capable of doing geometry or whatever, and we are capable because we have those inherent reasoning powers. Plato believed that we're always recollecting things. We are learning things we already knew before we were born. And I look at a scene in the final scene with where thus spake Zarathustra, na 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 ba bam. I look at how in that scene the character becomes older and older and older, and then he dies, and then he becomes a fetus, and he's become Superman, and that's indeed, and he knows everything. And I look at how the film recreates that Platonic idea in that scene of prenatal recollection. And then as well, I look at transcendence and how that relates. Obviously, Plato had an idea of the soul that survives the human body, and that later influenced Christianity. And I look at how there's that scene in particular is kind of cosmic transcendence. But then I look early in the film how there's a kind of animal transcendence, how the primates transcend the rest of the animal kingdom when they develop technological weapons and conquer the rest of the animal kingdom. All right, that's the first essay, which is called 2001, Cinema as a Platonic Ideal. The second essay is an essay called Jazz and Democracy, and I examine the similarities between the musical form of jazz and democratic principles, which might seem incongruous. But there's a lot written about this already, and I'm certainly not certainly not the first person to say this either. The reason why jazz is similar to democracy is because in a jazz ensemble, you have to play with the other players. You have to play in a certain beat. You have to play in a certain key. You have to play in a certain meter, and you have to listen to what the other person is playing, and then you play your own thing. But within that format, you can express yourself freely. You can do what you want and express yourself very creatively. So in that sense, it's similar to a liberal democracy, since in liberal democracies, you have to work with others, and with the need, you have to tolerate a plurality of cultures, but within that, you have freedom of assembly, you have freedom of speech, and you have civil rights. So you can do what you want, and you can do what you want within the parameters of the law. We have a lawful society, and within that you have individual liberties. And in that sense, jazz and democracy are similar. And then later on in the essay, I examine how the Soviet Union, communism, and the Nazi Germany, fascism, how both of those regimes clamped down, censored, and persecuted jazz. They both made it illegal. They both persecuted jazz musicians. Jazz musicians were sent to gulags in the Soviet Union, and jazz musicians, whatever, were sent to concentration camps. The reason why Nazi Germany did this is because it had links to Jews and to blacks, and for that reason, but also another reason why they both banned jazz was because it was degenerate art. It sounded in a certain way which was associated it with modernism, and both regimes clamped down on modernism. They saw it as degenerate, and both regimes, and it was free, and it was, as I said, within jazz you get free improvisation, free expression. And for that reason, both regimes clamped down on it, because jazz is an expression of freedom. And then yes, and as I said, yeah. Okay, that's that essay. I think I said everything there. I think there's something else I want to say. And the third essay is about the great movie by Frank Capra, It's a Wonderful Life. And I look at and I compare the movie It's a Wonderful Life with the principles of the New Deal. Of course, the New Deal were a series of social government programs that were introduced by Franklin Roosevelt after the Great Depression of 1929. The movie, in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, there's an institution called Building and Loans, which provides, say, loans into cash payments and mortgages for people who can't afford to buy their own homes, or for some reason or another go through rough times and need some help, financial assistance. And I compare this institution with some of the institutions that existed in during Roosevelt's New Deal. And what Roosevelt did is he banned banking companies from mixing with housing and with pensions, and he socialized pensions. And that's when he introduced the Social Security Act. He made pensions something something the government provided for the public, and it was something that was banned from being mixed with banking. Um, and in the film, you see a character called Potter, who's a banker, and Potter symbolizes the preceding economic system that led to the Great Depression, laissez-faire, a kind of doctrinaire free market, and the character George Bailey represents the kind of New Deal, the New Deal. It is an institution that will provide welfare for every American, so no American is too poor to live and to be denied housing and any kind of safety net that he can't otherwise afford because of lack of means. And and I look at and I analyze several scenes in the film where I look at particularly a lot of scenes involving George Bailey and Potter. So yes, that's that essay. The following essay is called Literary Creativity in Cinema. The reason why I wrote this essay was because I wanted to examine how the literary process, which involves someone alone in a room with a whatever piece of paper, imagination, whatever, or a laptop typewriter, how that kind of very mundane or mental, that kind of very mental cerebral activity, how that can be recreated by cinema. And I look at two films which both came out in the same year, and they're both quite similar. The one of the films is called Barton Fink by the Coen Brothers, and the other one is Naked Lunch by David Cronenberg. So, yeah, they both came out in the same year. Barton Fink is loosely based on a left-wing playwright from the 1930s called Clifford Odets. The Naked Lunch is loosely based on a novel by William Burroughs called Naked Lunch. And Naked Lunch and the film is mainly how Burroughs wrote the book rather than a literal adaptation of the novel. And so basically, going back to Barton Fink, Clifford Odets was a kind of left-wing social realist playwright. And something I examine in the essay is that while both of these writers write in the film, they are both of them confronted by themes that they write about whilst they're writing. So Barton Fink, whilst he's writing, is confronted by this kind of common man, because Barton Fink writes about the common man. But he's kind of very pretentious and pompous and full of himself, and the Coen Brothers satirize his and lampoon and mock his pretensions, and he constantly pontificates about the common man to this person, and he never lets him talk. But what the film reveals is that this common man is a serial killer, and Barton Fink has pigeonholed him as a member of a class due to his class politics, but he is in fact a very complex individual. And I look at how he writes this play within a day, and how the Coen Brothers use camera angles and sound design and music to bring about this sense of exhilaration that he feels while he's writing this play, this film script in a single night. The other film is Naked Lunch, and the Cronenberg Burroughs, the character in the film, it has these insect typewriters, and he has all sorts of strange hallucinations because of his drug taking, and he types on typewriters. And William Burroughs wrote about extermination, about insects, and he also wrote about a talking arsehole in a sketch in Naked Lunch, and the insect typewriter, as a talking arsehole attached at the back. And several other themes crop up while he's writing. For example, paranoia. He's constantly being persecuted by the government, and obviously drug use is a big theme that comes up. So basically, in this essay, I examine how David Cronenberg and the Coen brothers recreate the literary process in film. So the next one is a bit more historical. It's a comparison between the 1950s and the 1990s, and basically how these were prosperous decades of very, very high growth and vast improvement in living standards. But these were complacent decades which created problems in subsequent decades. So when I look at the 1950s, I mainly look at Great Britain, and when I look at the 1990s, I look at the whole world, the whole global economy. So in the 50s, you had Harold Macmillan as Prime Minister, and he made this famous statement: "You've never had it so good." But you had all these welfare pensions, welfare state pensions, the NHS, trade union reform, which appeared to make the ideals of the Labour Party redundant. And Anthony Crosland wrote this book called Future of Socialism, in which he mentions that the Labour Party has to revise its attitude to things like nationalisation, and basically attitudes towards industry were very complacent. Great Britain thought that it would keep living off the empire. All the profits would keep coming in from the empire, and there was modernization did not occur. Managers of companies like British Leylands and Ferranti, they didn't try to modernize industry sufficiently well. They didn't upskill their workers. They didn't upskill their plants, and they adhered to very outdated working practices and methods. And by the time of the 1970s, you had double-digit inflation, which was caused by trade, both by weak management of industry as well as industrial unrest and industrial disputes with the trade unions, as well as the oil crisis. So what happened was, after the 1950s, there was even this assumption that it would keep growing, despite what was then like 4% inflation and high wages, high growth. It would keep growing, but for that reason, the Labour Party thought they might not ever get back into power ever again. But the subsequent Labour governments from 64 till 70 and 74 till 79 were also complacent, because they also assumed that the economy would keep growing, and because of that, they would be able to keep redistributing wealth. They would be able to keep doing their social and economic reforms. The economic growth did not continue, and it eventually stalled in the 1970s. Whereas the 1990s, you have the end of the Cold War, and you, again, unheralded levels of growth, unheralded living standards. You had 4% growth. Poverty was at an all-time low. Capitalism was going into places like Southeast Asia and Africa, and globalization and capitalism were starting to bring those countries out of what was essentially starvation, famines. The globalization was bringing the whole economy, the whole world into unheralded levels of growth, and for that reason, Francis Fukuyama made that famous statement, "The end of history." So history for him appeared to have culminated, and it had kind of reached a plateau. But then it was also, as this essay argues, a complacent decade, because um, uh, for two reasons. It was complacent in terms of economic policy, and it was complacent in terms of foreign policy, because of successes in places like Kosovo, successful military interventions in places like Kosovo and Sierra Leone. There was an assumption that you could intervene and start promoting liberal democracies and liberal values to countries such as in the Middle East, which were very illiberal and which were promoting a type of militant Islamism. And this was undone finally, of course, with the invasion of Iraq, which was a catastrophe and led to a Shia Sunni sectarian conflict, and led finally at the end to kind of a nascent Islamic caliphate, which was ISIS, and it led to chaos in the Middle East. So in that sense, foreign policy was complacent, but there was also complacency in terms of economic policy, because financial regulation, the financial sector, starting in the 80s, was deregulated, but it deregulated even further in the 1990s. And for example, the Bank of England was deregulated. The Bank of England deregulated oversight of the bank of financial regulation, and also led George Bush, Bill Clinton, and George Bush Jr. both took financial deregulation further, which led, of course, to the financial crisis of 2008, which brought the whole economy into a worldwide recession. And of course, both of these attitudes towards the economy and to foreign policy have led directly or indirectly to demagogues like Donald Trump in the United States, and to things like Brexit. Okay, so that was that essay, 1950s, 1990s. The second essay, the next essay is an essay called "The Communal Town and the Liberal City." In this essay, I explore as to how towns could be described as being more communal, whereas cities are more liberal. And I start by offering definitions of liberalism and communitarianism. I argue that towns are more communal because they often conserve traditions. People live there for a long time. People often all know each other. They use the same shops. They use the same shopping centres. And in that sense, things are more shared. Whereas cities are more multifarious. They're comprised of millions, in many cases, thousands or millions of individuals who often pursue conflicting goals and individual goals. And for that reason, they're more liberal. I start by looking at the ideas of communitarianism and liberalism in antiquity, in Plato and Aristotle. And then after that, I look at the think tank Blue Labour as an example of more communitarian thinking. But then I look at why cities are often the center of finance, and finance is where there's trade from all over the world, and you trade with all over the world, and and cities are more amenable, they're more welcoming of immigrants, whereas towns are less welcoming or less amenable to immigration. And and because of something like Brexit, which was towns in the north were the center of manufacturing, and after the decimation of manufacturing after the 1980s, these towns were where you have things like these mining communities where you had full employment, high wages, greater security, greater pensions. After all that's disappeared, you have mass outrage, which was manifested in something like Brexit. And after something like Brexit occurred because of these small communal towns have been neglected by policymakers. And I argue that cities reached they crossed a 50% threshold of the population living in them in the 1920s. And I argue that after the 1920s, you see the rise of more individualistic liberal thought systems such as existentialism and modernism. And I look at why existentialism and modernism are more individualistic, because existentialism is all about making your own moral choices in a universe where God is dead and you have to create your own moral values. And then I look at The Trial by Franz Kafka, and I argue that um, the character in the novel is alienated in this vast industrialized city, and he's all alone. And that's this created a greater kind of atomism where people do not meet each other. And it also the rise of the city leads to more administration, and the administration creates this huge bureaucracy which represses him and even intrudes his private individual life. And this vast administration and bureaucracy, as I said, becomes always totalitarian because it controls every sphere of his life and it won't leave him alone. And that's something the rise of the city has led to. And it's also led to the end of religion because the character is not religious. And there's a scene in the church in the film, and the city has led to decline in kind of shared values like religion. The next essay is about this author I like called J.G. Ballard, and the essay examines the relationship between paganism and the fiction of J.G. Ballard. So I look at a few things about paganism. To start with, I look at how pagan ideas of kind of time and time before was kind of, we used to have a more kind of circular notion of time, which was derived from kind of pagan Hindu or Buddhist ideas, unlike the kind of more linear Christian idea that we've inherited, and those which led to Nietzsche arguing about the creating this idea of eternal recurrence to as an idea against that Christian idea, and I look at how that comes through in J.G. Ballard's novel The Drowned World, that idea of eternal recurrence, because this is the future and the polar ice caps melt, global warming, similar, and the character constantly experiences moments from many centuries ago. He's always he's experiencing the 19th century or ancient Egypt. He's always or the Triassic age. He's always constantly experiencing things that happened before he was even born. So that I look at how that idea of the eternal recurrence is recreated in that novel. And I also look at ideas about Heidegger, who had this idea of being, which is a very complex concept. But one aspect of being is that time is unchangeable and doesn't alter. And I look at how that idea, how time constantly recurs. So there's that essential essence and changeability of time always recurs with the character. And another thing I look about Heidegger is how everything we see is shaped by our social environment, so we can never see objects as they truly are. And I look at how that affects Karen's, the character Joel Weld, his perception of time, because he no longer sees things, because he doesn't really see things and through the prism of 30th century London, wherever the novel is set. And after that, I look at his novel Crash, and I look at transgression, and I try to tie back together paganism by saying that paganism was transgressive, because paganism involved trespassing borders, which is indeed what transgression is. It's about crossing moral pieties and taboos. And I look at how Crash indeed does this, because it's a film. It's a book about how characters have sex whilst having sex during car crashes, and it leads to wounds and scabs, and this leads to sexual arousal and sexual intercourse. And look at how that offends our pieties and our taboos, and what is acceptable, and in what ways. Ballard, by writing about often revolting things in the novel, how this makes it transgressive, and why that is pagan. The third novel I look at in the essay is the Unlimited Dream Company, and I relate it to ideas about from Dionysian rituals, and Dionysian rituals were often involved. Again, it was kind of transgressive, about trespassing borders, but it was about these praying to the god of intoxication and ecstasy, which was the god of wine, and it was Dionysius, and they would do all sorts of things like eat, make sacrifices with dead children, and all sorts of things. And I look at how the Unlimited Dream Company recreates that by this character who does all sorts of unusual things in the novel, like they all become animals, and he spreads semen around, and this leads to wildlife and vegetation and trees growing. And there's a scene I look at in the novel which involves them becoming animals, and I look at how that's Dionysian, because Dionysian rituals, they often pretended to be animals by donning masks, and they became animals. And I look at how that comes through in The Unlimited Dream Company by G.G. Ballard. Finally, the final essay in the book is about Jorge Luis Borges, which is another writer I like a lot, and it's about comparing the short story The Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges with the principles of the internet. So I look at how I saw, because the Library of Babel is about this library that's constantly expanding, and it contains every possible permutation of kind of lived experience, and every single book ever written, but also every possible permutation. It's constantly expanding. And I look at, the reason why I chose the internet is because the internet is perhaps the vastest source of knowledge and information. It is indeed constantly expanding, because it's made up of billions of pages. And one of the things I look at in the essay is how there's these inquisitors who try to find their own vindications. And I look at how that's similar to Twitter, because Twitter includes people who are very vindictive and try to justify the worldview, their political worldview. And there are inquisitors often end up fighting each other, and I compare that with fights in Twitter. And another thing I look at is how I compare it with WikiLeaks, because there's this sect who try to recreate canonical books by shuffling letters around, and this is illegal, and basically the authorities clamp down on it. And I compare how that is similar to the kind of illegal activity, such as hacking into confidential information that WikiLeaks did with Julian Assange. And I look at how each individual book is different, and each individual page on the internet is different, and each individual page on the internet is created by each individual with his own DNA, which has his own strand of genetic information. Another thing I look at in the essay is how the books in the library they're often meaningless books, which are just created by just patterns. They're just meaningless, like of the same three letters again and again. And I look at bots on the internet, which often create this completely meaningless gibberish. And I look at quite cheekily say that although like some people look for meaning in the books in the so many people think these books are very meaningful in Borges' library. They're just gibberish. And I compare it with French postmodernist philosophy, like things like Deleuze, and how many academics look for meaning in these texts when they're probably meaningless. The other thing I look at in the essay, is how they in the short story the librarians look for a book that encompasses all of the books. So I compare that with search engines, and I compare it with search engines. And although another thing about the library is that it's constantly expanding, and although if everyone could read every single book in the library, they would have to read it all over again, because no single reading of a book will be sufficient. So you can never read a book once and understand all of it. So that's a very clever thing about the short story in Borges' book, because it shows you, although you might read everything, you will still not understand all of it, and no single reading will give you everything will reveal everything to you about that book. And I compare that with how there's so many interpretations on the internet, and that those interpretations keep expanding. And I show how those and I point out websites like Goodreads where people store their own reviews. So yeah, that took a lot longer than the previous video because I was talking about each essay, and it's I'll soon start selling it on Amazon. Thank you.